Welcome back to Trash Talks, the official podcast of Second Life, where environmental conservation meets innovation. We're combining drone tech, AI, community, and research to restore our oceans and give the planet a second chance. From drone powered cleanups to community led activism, every week we dive into another topic that we hope will inspire you for change. My name is Patricia, I'm an intern in Second Life, and I'm super excited for today's episode.
Hi, like Patricia, I'm also interning at Second Life. My name is Lena, and I'm really happy to be back on Trash Talks today with another guest speaker and another extremely interesting topic that we'll cover today. So, getting right into today's episode, we're asking what happens to something after we throw it away? And how does that away kind of not just affect nature, but also the people's lives? So, currently, waste is often attributed to a growing capitalist society and consumerist lifestyles. And there's a really, really strong quote that I recently read in a book called The Human Planet, How We Created the Anthropocene by Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin. And they say, our enormous productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life. We need things consumed, burnt, worn out, replaced, and discarded at an ever-increasing rate.
Yes, Lena, this actually sounds very dystopian, but if you actually look around, I think it's not that far from reality.
Yeah, and then Patricia, like, what actually happens with all this waste? Can you give us some more statistics on that?
Yes, so Lena, as always, we have come prepared with different quick facts to frame today's conversation. So these facts are, first of all, globally, only about 20% of waste is recycled every year. Second, in Japan, the World Bank projects 2.2 billion tons of waste yearly by 2025, with collection services covering less than half of that. Then, when it comes to plastic, every year we produce over 400 million tons, but only 9% is recycled. And between 19 and 23 million tons of plastic enter aquatic ecosystems annually, which is quite dangerous. And finally, my last fact is that in 2020, textile production was the third largest contributor to water degradation, generating 12.6 million tons of textile waste.
Okay, wow, yeah. And I think if you might have already kind of listened in a bit, you might notice that one of the, or you can angle this episode will be going, is fashion. And so I think it's really important when we discuss plastic to also acknowledge how significantly the fashion industry contributes to plastic waste. So 11% of plastic waste comes from clothing and textiles, with only 8% of textile fibers in 2023 made from recycled sources. And then kind of when you think about what your own impact is, so on average, clothing, household textiles, and footwear production just for EU households requires 234 million tons of raw materials. To address all of these challenges, the EU recently launched the EU Strategy for Sustainable and Circular Textiles, where the objectives are that all textile products in the EU market are durable, repairable, and recyclable. Fast fashion is out of fashion, and profitable reuse and repaid services are widely available. And the textile sector remains competitive, but it's also resilient, innovative, and producers take responsibility for their products. Now, I think when we look at this, it all still seems very utopian. And so it'll be exciting to see kind of how we get into that today and what process is actually being made to reach any of these targets.
That's right, Lena. And on that notion, I think we should consider a recent case study which actually highlights Ghana's status as the world's largest importer of used clothing, with actually 15 million items of discarded garments arriving each week. And I think this is something I hope we can look into it in this episode because we can connect this umbrella of plastic waste to fashion waste and actually discuss what we need to do as consumers and also inhabitants of this planet.
Right. And so that's why we're honored to be joined by Lucy Siegel today. So welcome to Trash Talks. And thank you so much for your time and in joining us today.
I'm delighted to be joining you. Thank you for inviting me.
For anyone who doesn't know you, hasn't had the opportunity to read many of your many articles and books, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how you kind of got into this subject area?
Sure. So I am Lucy and I'm a climate and nature journalist. And I've been writing about the environment since I started writing professionally in about 2004. And I started on a newspaper, which is a thing that was made from paper that younger listeners may not be familiar with. Before online, we used to consume our news in lots of dead tree media. And I worked for the world's oldest Sunday newspaper, The Observer. And we had a history of writing about alternative movements to capitalism. So E.F. Schumacher, who was a philosopher and I guess an anti-capitalist, anti-colonial economist from the last century, wrote a manifestation called Small is Beautiful, reimagining the world economy in the 1940s, 1950s. And The Observer was the first place to publish this. And I became very interested in alternatives to capitalism, which had less environmental impact. And I started looking at different sectors, what we eat, how we grow and consume food, how we travel, how we educate our children, how we are educated. And eventually I looked at fashion. And once I started looking at fashion, I couldn't really stop, because for me, it was, it had it all, really. It basically explained all the issues, all the problems in one neat conceit. And that is why once I started investigating fashion, I never really stopped.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for this introduction. And now that we know you a little bit better, I want to start a bit with the big picture. So you have been reporting on single-use plastic since, well, before it became dinner table conversation. So my question is, if you had to map the curve of public awareness from 2007 to now, would it look like a steady rise, a sharp spike, or a bit of a wobbly roller coaster? How would you describe it?
Well, there's definitely a sharp spike around 2017. And in 2017, a natural history presenter called Sir David Attenborough he presented a series, a flagship, as we call it, nature series for the BBC, which is the UK's public broadcasting arm, where I work as well. And it was about the ocean and ocean life. And 15 minutes of a whole network TV series, which, runs to, I don't know, probably about 8 to 10 hours, just 15 minutes was devoted to the plastic crisis. And what happened was that the camera operatives, the camera people who make these beautiful films, stopped doing what they normally do. And what they had done to that point was to move the plastic from the screen so that the viewer didn't see the plastic waste. Instead, the viewer saw the majesty and awe of nature, of the natural world. But the decision was taken to leave the plastic in the shot. And that decision was taken because it was real. And to move the plastic away from the camera lens would have been to falsify. And the BBC, we have very, very strict editorial guidelines around telling the truth. And that is why the plastic was allowed to stay. And it changed everything. When you combine those images with Sir David Attenborough, who's a very, very trusted figure in the UK, he's in his 90s. We grew up with him. If you're interested in the environment, you grew up watching his series on television. And that's how many of us learned about the environment. That's how we received our environmental education. And he was telling us that we were killing the planet. We were killing these animals. And in particular, this series in this 15 minutes followed the story of a young whale calf. And the implication was that it had died from plastic pollution. And at that point, millions and millions of people who watched this show took notice, and they asked themselves, what are we doing? And the answer was really clear. It was the stuff that we have in our hands of every minute of every day, all the plastic products that we use that seem so safe and friendly and boring, that we're wreaking this havoc on the natural world and killing other species. And at that moment, there was a massive spike. And in that moment, certainly in the UK, our supermarkets, we're a big supermarket economy, which means we're a very big plastic economy because supermarkets wrap everything in plastic. The supermarkets suddenly were receiving phone calls and emails and tweets from people saying, we demand that you address this problem. And that began to shift a lot of the way that people worked and approached this subject. Now, in terms of, you asked me, is this a sort of smooth trajectory? Has it been growing ever since? Well, obviously, there are peaks, there are spikes, and there are troughs. And some of those troughs are deeper than the Mariana Trench, which is the deepest place in the ocean. And COVID, which happened immediately afterwards, so 2 to 3 years after this massive spike in consciousness and this massive shift, brought plastic back into people's lives in a way that we are yet to recover from. So it is not a curve. It's not a beautiful curve. It's not a beautiful trajectory by any sense of the word. Sometimes the public is engaged. Sometimes the public is not engaged. And that's the reality of campaigning on plastics.
Well, Lucy, thank you so much for this response. And still talking about plastics, I wanted to ask you, on LinkedIn, you recently called out the stop demonizing plastic narrative in one of your posts, which actually caught our attention. And I wanted to ask you, can you tell us why does this framing concern you more specifically, and how do we hold space for nuance, acknowledging plastics usefulness, like for example in medicine or in emergency response, but at the same time still pushing hard against their unnecessary overuse, especially in fashion, but also in other areas as well?
Yeah, so I've always been really clear. In 2018, I published a book called Turning the Tide on Plastics. And I was really clear in that because I studied the history of plastic production. There is a playbook that the plastics industry has, and it's been in development for, hundreds of years. Plastic is a very, very old material. It's often presented as an innovation. In reality, it's changed very little since it started being used very widely in the 1950s. And if you've ever watched a series called Mad Men, which is about the advertising industry and 1950s culture, you will know about plastic and consumerism and how close they are and how they travel together. The advertising industry got you to consume more stuff, and therefore you consume more plastic. And that was a deliberate attempt to bolster the economy, and we've decided that is progress. What has happened more latterly is that we now realize that progress comes at such a big cost that we're actually poisoning the planet. And we also know that these plastics are made from fossil fuel, from oil, and we know that we live in a climate crisis. So plastic is the embodiment of the climate and nature crisis, the dual crisis, which now affects our very survival as a species. So there's that. However, the system, life is not perfect. It's very far from perfect. And we live in a system where plastic is known as the skin of commerce. So it's known as being the substance which enables our consumerist lifestyles, and lots of people feel very comfortable in those lifestyles. If you suggested that you were going to take away everyday products from people, they would be extremely worried, and with good effect. Plastic has also enabled a limited but important number of leaps forward. So you will find plastic in space shuttles, for example. Space exploration would not have been feasible without plastics. You will also find it in cars that we use every day. Electric vehicles probably have more plastic than standard cars because it allows them to be lighter and hold a heavier battery and all the rest of it. So plastic is very, very important. In a healthcare setting, we found disposable plastics to work within treating large numbers of people in small amounts of time, which is obviously critical. However, it's really, really important to understand that we can innovate better materials which are not plastic, because plastic has a lot of drawbacks. And the main drawback of plastic is the same as the reason why we love it. It's extremely durable. It doesn't melt away, it doesn't evaporate, and it's very, very hard to get rid of. Plastic will be there, and that's what's killing the planet. So the very thing that makes us want to use it is the thing that is holding us back. The plastics industry has a vested interest in not changing, in the status quo. It does not want the millions of manufacturing units around the world to have to change. It doesn't want to stop using fossil fuel. It doesn't want to change using the tiny pellets of plastic, which are the raw ingredients, which are shipped all around the world in containers and often spill into the sea or escape in some way, which exacerbate the problem because they are ready-made pieces of microplastic pollution. It doesn't want any of that to change. The share price is invested, people are invested, pensions are invested. It is an inconvenience for them to change. Al Gore, many years ago, the climate activist, wrote a book called The Inconvenient Truth, which became a film. This is an inconvenient truth for the plastics industry. The plastics industry is also the fossil fuel industry. They are so closely linked, you cannot slip a piece of paper between them. Or maybe it's more accurate to say you cannot slip a piece of plastic film between them. You know, they are the same industry. So you can see how all of these vested interests line up against change, against campaigners, and against pro-wildlife, pro-planet campaigners. And therefore, they are used to creating campaigns themselves. They have their own playbook. It's not just activists that have that. They're very well resourced. They're financially very, very well off. And people are inclined to listen to them. So one of the campaigns that they have run with varying degrees of success since the 1950s is telling us to stop demonizing plastics. You know, it's a sort of very patronizing way of saying, you know, they're not as bad as you're saying. In fact, what would your life be without them? Well, what we've always said as campaigners feeding in to a global system which acknowledges that we must scale back on our use of plastics is that we acknowledge that plastics are very important in some respects. You know, heart valves are made from plastic now, space shuttles, you know, engineering, all of the things that I've talked about. But as society, we need to understand why we are giving equal weight to plastic for heart valves and plastic that covers a coconut so that it can be sold in a supermarket with a barcode on. By the way, just to be clear, coconuts do not need to be wrapped in plastic because Mother Nature has provided a strong shell, a strong husk, a strong hairy husk to protect them, to protect the coconut inside. So the plastics industry has always tried to avoid this reasonable, logical argument and flips to campaigns saying that if you raise an objection to plastic, you are demonizing an important industry. That is clearly not what's going on.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting because I mean, I also often go to the supermarket and have cucumbers wrapped in plastic, or you see apples and oranges wrapped in plastic, especially oranges where like, you peel the shell off anyway. But I also wanted to quickly talk back about when we talk about everyday plastic, we also should talk about polyester, right? Because that's like the silent plastic in our wardrobes. That's nearly every clothing item. If you don't watch out, you can find polyester in it. And so I think sometimes, or we've been kind of talking about this, real problem might not necessarily be the material itself, but rather how recklessly it's being managed. So if there's kind of a lack of accountability and a lack of kind of closed cycles. And so I wanted to ask you, if we want to fix kind of this strange kind of plastic fashion mess, is there anything we should focus our attention on first? Is it on global plastic treaties or the responsibility schemes or even the more local upgrades and recycling initiatives? Is there anything that you think would really help the plastic industry within fashion?
Yeah, I mean, these are all really super interesting questions, which I could probably talk to you about for a week, but I'll try and keep it short. So, in terms of the polyester crisis, fossil fuel fashion, as we've come to talk about it, is so important. And I think campaigners have done a really good job in, you know, the last sort of 5 years of really raising the issue of polyester in our wardrobes, because that's really, really important to do, because countries, Western consumerist societies, have a real responsibility to stop pumping out plastic garments onto the planet without any real plan for collection and disposal. And it is very, very difficult to hold fashion conglomerates. So these vast, vast businesses, these huge brands that own so much retail space, on high streets, in malls, all the rest of it. But they are so embedded in national economies, and they really can do whatever they want, because the GDP of many Western economies is often entwined with the success of these companies. If they fail, then we fail. They're often now part of big holding companies as well. So, you might buy from a big brand and you might love fashion. They're not really that into it. Like, they also own pet food companies, sugar, lots of different conglomerates, essentially. The fashion is just a way of making money, and they are always going to make it from the cheapest fiber available. And they don't really care what impact that fiber is having. So polyester is a clear winner for them with their priorities. And that is because you can basically produce as much of it as you want. You basically crack oil in a refinery. You drill oil, you crack oil, you refine it, you spin it into a filament, you can ship it around the world. There's no restrictions on it. Incredibly, at this point in history, we're saying there's no restrictions on oil production. Can you believe that? It's so incredible to me. But, we've even found instances of fashion going back to coal power for cheap energy to produce polyester. This is really, really dirty, dirty production. And for a high street brand or an online brand that is fast fashion and ultra fast fashion, maybe we'll talk about the distinction, there really is no downside to doing this. It means they don't have to get involved with those annoying people called farmers and producers and growers who grow natural fibers for production, because that's infinitely more complicated. You have to plan in advance. A cotton grower needs to know what staple length you want. And as a designer, you would have to understand what staple length cotton you want, because it would affect what you're designing. Do you want jersey weight? Do you want light cotton? These are all, professional jobs that people used to have in the fashion industry. What has happened with this system of production is you just switch to plastic. You don't have to be responsible for any of those people in the supply chain, and neither do you have to be able to actually do your job. You can just design using a computer program, AI, whatever, because you're just molding plastic, essentially. You can then build a machine or buy a machine that molds the plastic for you. And then you get some very, very, very vulnerable worker in one of the textile production hotspots, say Bangladesh or Vietnam or Myanmar, and you basically get them to sew on their machine the same seam, hundreds of times a day for very little wages in very, very cramped and dangerous conditions. And they will just sew that little molded plastic for you. So you see how you have a license to print money. And that is how plastic has become embedded in the fashion industry. And polyester has overtaken all of the other fibers that are available to fashion. And it's a lot more than you think, because we don't have a very biodiverse fashion system. Biodiversity is fundamentally important to having a healthy environment, whether it's the amount of plants, the amount of trees, in your local area, or how many different fibers you have in your wardrobe, And if you don't have biodiversity, I can tell you hands down, you have a problem.
Yeah. So, Lucy, thank you so much for this. You were just talking about fast fashion, and I wanted to talk a bit more about this. So, you were talking that like these companies are worried about making like using the cheapest fiber, but at the same time using the cheapest labor, right? So, we often see this the worst impacts of fast fashion fall hardest on garment workers, as you were talking about just now, who are usually women, young people, and marginalized communities that bear the brunt of these fashion waste exports. Yet, all these communities are leading the innovation in zero waste and reuse systems, such as Africa Collect Textiles in Kenya, for example, or even the United Wardrobe Market. So I feel like this will be a little bit of a double question, so you might have to keep your answer a bit short for this. But the questions would be, first, what impact does fashion waste have on these communities that end up being the waste receiving? What is the final impact and the final outcome on them? And can you maybe say who would be inspiring you right now? Like, are there any grassroots or product heroes that we should know about?
So, traditionally, the communities that receive fashion waste have, had a really, really tough time. I mean, that's putting it mildly, because fashion waste wasn't really acknowledged. So the things that I've described up to this point in this conversation, I'm talking about these big brands who are getting away with murder, because if you're going into the fashion business in the last 20 years, you're also going into the waste and recycling business, but they're only doing one half of the job, right? They're just selling the clothes. They're just pumping out the clothes. So if you think, some reports suggest we're pumping out 120 billion new garments a year, if you think most of those are made from plastic fibers now, then we still don't have a plan to collect and deal with the previous 120 billion times 20, whatever number we're up to now. So how is it that they're allowed to pump out even more? So we know that these get dumped into communities. And because fashion waste hasn't really been talked about until relatively recently, and I really take my hat off, I'm not literally wearing a hat, I know this is a podcast, but my metaphorical hat off to anybody who has addressed this issue, because it's the most important issue at this point. Just think about how those communities have had to suffer in silence. And they've basically had fashion waste tipped onto them, literally in some cases. And sometimes it's been in the form of aid. So, we're going to help you. And we know about all these instances of jumpers and knitwear being dumped in in Kenya, for example, where the climate does not require those sort of garments. So we've had all of these mismatches. One of the most striking examples of the amount of fashion and how it can go wrong is Kantamanta Market in Ghana. You mentioned Ghana being one of the main areas where fashion waste is received, and there was a very, very serious fire there last year. And that fire and waste garments is always an issue. It happens in the go downs in Bangladesh, which surround the garment production districts, and you just see very informal handling of fashion waste, where garments are stacked and piled into very small spaces where people live cheek by jowl, and maybe there's cooking going on, there's electrification, which is informal and sometimes sets fire, there's great heat increasing because of climate change, there's flooding on occasion. These are not the right conditions for managing this waste. And when things do go wrong, it is obviously those local recyclers who lose out, because they lose the waste. Within that, we also have opportunity. I think you said in your introduction, you pointed out the mismatch between the amount of waste in the world and the huge disparity in the amount of collection, recycling services and systems across the world. So if you look at that and you're an entrepreneur, it's very obvious what you do. You get into the waste and recycling industry and you make it work. And this is why we see the real innovation not around material production, because as we have already alluded to, the garment and fashion industry doesn't really want to change. They're happy with the status quo. What they clearly have a problem with is waste. What they clearly don't want to take responsibility for is waste. However, in any entrepreneurial country, and having been to Ghana, I think it's one of the most entrepreneurial countries on earth, you are going to get innovators in that space. And then in terms of who are my sort of heroes in that space, rather than NGOs that go in, I think for me it's the innovators themselves. And often these are very, very literally one-man bands, people working by themselves. And I think the UN runs a really, really good innovation program where it goes literally into marketplaces. And I don't mean online, I mean physical marketplaces, and actually talent spots innovators, and works with the team there, works with innovators to get those stories out and bring them to the surface and make sure that they can continue.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. So now we've kind of discussed a lot of the issues with plastic waste. And I think for many people or who might be listening, they might not have directly come across the actual impacts it has on the community and on the global system. They might just think, oh, well, if I'm donating something, it must go somewhere good and it must help people. Now we kind of were thinking of how can we phrase this, like what can people actually do to really help change their fashion footprint and plastic footprint? Because again, like people might think, oh, if I'm donating my clothes, I'm giving it into a cycle. They might not actually know, oh, well, this doesn't actually reach anyone. This goes into a landfill somewhere. And do you have any tips that might be unexpected or creative that people might not really realize and that we can challenge our listeners with to kind of act upon?
I think really it's more of a state of thinking about things. So, the more educated you are about it, like listening to podcasts like this, the more that you will understand, like nobody should really be donating clothes or getting rid of clothes thinking they're doing a great service for humanity. Like if that's all you're contributing, you need to do something else, right? I mean, if you're still thinking, oh, this is great, this is going to go to somebody and they're going to love it. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily the way it works. If you have got a piece of clothing that is a really, really good piece of clothing, and we all know what a good piece of clothing looks like, and something that's really precious to you, and you genuinely want to give that to somebody, then give it to somebody. Give it to someone if you're feeling generous, and say, this would look great on you. You should wear this. I'm not getting the wear out of it. That's lovely. You get something from it. They get something from it. But if you are donating to Goodwill or to a charity shop and you are using it as a chance to clear out your wardrobe, be honest with yourself about that. There's nothing wrong with that, but be honest with yourself about it. And you can always engage with the organization that you are donating these clothes to. I'm using those air quotes, by the way. I know it's a podcast. And ask them, or look on the website, do a bit of research. What do they actually need at the moment? So there's a few thrift stores near where I live, charity thrift stores, and they often need clean, new as possible exercise wear. So I know to take it to them. And I'm a terrible person for buying things that don't fit me and not returning them. So, I know that if I have a new pair of running shoes, there is somebody who shops in there that would like them. I know that they're not going to get exported because there's a market here for them. So I liaise with people like that. I'm always going in and saying, hey, what do you need? What do you have too much of? We should all know people who are volunteers in recycling at this point, and we probably all do. Like, what is the worst bugbear? And normally it's unclean polyester garments that they can't really do anything with. We have an organization here called I think it's international, the Salvation Army, and they've invested in a polyester recycling machine at one of their depots. So I know that if something is pure polyester rather than blended, because lots of things are blended, that they will be able to take it and they may be able to recycle it in their polyester machine. I do things like after speaking to them, I will sometimes rip out the lining if that's not full polyester, because if there's a lining in it, which is a different fiber, then that's an issue. So the more knowledge you have, the better recycler you can be. And, we have to accept some clothes get worn out. But ultimately, the metric that matters is numbers of wears of every garment. We have research in the UK, and I've seen similar international research, that if you increase the lifespan of any garment by 6 to 9 months, then you can cut its carbon footprint, its embodied footprint, so all the things that went into making it, by 30 to 40%. That is worth doing. We should be wearing our clothes until the bitter end. We all know about make and mend and repairing, very, very important parts of this strategy. But there will still be things that won't work out. So it's about having a really, as much as you try and consume consciously, you must approach the end of life with as much consciousness.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that after this talk, our listeners for sure will try to recycle more or try to fix their clothes more often instead of just getting rid of them. So finally, I just want to say that we always try to end on a little bit of hope. So we know that this work can be daunting. And so we know that the plastic problem is actually massive and the fashion industry moves fast and often in the wrong direction. And there are many problems related to this, as you were mentioning the whole episode. So I wanted to ask you, what keeps you going and what would you say to someone who cares deeply but feels overwhelmed right now?
The best thing to do is always to get stuck in. And, if you do feel overwhelmed, one of the best things to do is to be an active participant in recycling, remaking, mending, because fashion is just clothing, and clothing is just stuff that we made from material with our own hands. Again, this is a podcast, but I'm lifting my hands to the screen. So if you want to engage all of those parts and give yourself a bit of space away from this crazy, I mean, come on, the politics of everyday life at the moment are so crazy. If you want to give yourself a bit of space and a bit of thinking space, you need to make something, change something, alter something. Fashion is so beautiful for that, because we are creative beings. We need to express ourselves. You may not be a fashion designer. You may not going to be producing a whole collection. We don't really need whole collections. But have you tried the meditative effect of embroidery? Have you created a little bit of time for yourself to go and do a workshop on Japanese mending? Have you let some of that beauty into your life? Have you combined the practical with the creative? When was the last time you knitted something, sewed something, took that time for yourself, took that space for yourself, just to really, really look at the seams and work out the puzzle of how a garment fits together? Because that's the most beautiful thing to do. The way that humans are able to wrap themselves in fabric and adorn themselves and then change that fabric into something that expresses the elements of who they are is so great. And if you're not gifted with sewing, or you don't think it's your kind of thing, you could go to a textiles museum, a local museum which has some textiles, or just spend an hour or two geeking out on, how they used to make puff sleeves in the Victorian era, whatever it is for you. Or maybe you're more of a futuristic person, or maybe there's a designer that really lifts your heart, and you could literally go to the library and look at their work in a book. If you're into art, these things are very instinctive to you. Because fashion is also practical and we wear garments every day, we often forget about the beauty of it. And that makes us vulnerable to all of this dystopian chaos and this plastic nonsense that's swirling around us. So you could even wear something that you don't wear very much because it's a bit ridiculous. Or you could plan to go to an event and maybe your friend has something really nice and say, I need a fashion moment. Can I borrow that? Just to reconnect with the beauty, authenticity, and self-expression of how creative fashion is. Because let me tell you, resistance is not all about posting tweets with numbers in about fashion or about plastic production. Resistance is about tapping into who you are and living some sort of creative truth. In fact, that's probably the most powerful resistance there is.
Thank you, Lucy, so much for your words. Those are very inspiring, and I hope our listeners were as inspired as we were by listening to you. At this point, I think we can start wrapping up. This was our last question to you, so we cannot thank you enough, Lucy, for coming on today and helping us understand a bit more about the impacts of the fashion waste.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for your insightful, intelligent questions.
Thanks. I'm going to close off today's episode. Looking forward from today's discussion, like we mentioned in the last episode, between the 5th and 14th of August, there will be the second part of the 5th sessions of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, where they're developing an internationally legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, so particularly for the marine environment. So that's something that you should all keep in mind and look into the next couple of weeks, and we'll inform you more as the results get out. To stay up to date on Second Life's work, you can subscribe to the podcast to get notifications when we release new episodes, and visit our website, www.secondlife.ngo, to either join or host a cleanup, apply as a volunteer, donate or partner. You can also follow Second Life on Instagram at secondlife.ngo for some more sneak peeks into what we get up to. And finally, to everyone listening and to Lucy, thank you for your time today. We encourage you all to stay curious and stay rebellious, and don't let fast fashion talk you into forgetting your power. So maybe we can all start embroidering and crocheting, fixing up some of our old clothes that we don't think we would like to wear, that we wouldn't like to wear anymore. So we hope to have you back next week, where we will have a very special guest joining us to talk some more about ocean cleanups and water politics.
Shake it